Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Junior English. We now turn to Act 1 of Arthur Miller's play Crucible. I'm with you on 1123. We'll be taking some notes right away now with you at 2B, just to make sure that we're all on board with some of the information that's provided here under literary analysis. Notice we're going to start with this notion of plot, the sequence of events that happen in a story. I know you already know this, but let's summarize nonetheless. Plots follow a series of phrases that, taken together, are called the dramatic arc. Plot is always driven by a conflict or struggle between opposing forces, as we've often pointed out, internal, external conflict. Let's get these terms, however, in our notes. Rising action, the conflict is introduced and begins to build. Climax, the conflict reaches its moment of greatest intensity. This is the turning point when an event signals the final outcome. The falling action, sometimes referred to as the denouement, the conflict diminishes, approaches resolution, and finally the resolution, where the conflict ends. In a long, complex narrative such as this play, there may be multiple conflicts in this play. Miller uses dramatic exposition or prose commentaries to provide background information about the characters and their world. I'd like to point out that some of that information is some of the more important information of the study of the play. We will be working then line by line with this play. We'll be listening to a performance of the play. However, the performance will not include this dramatic exposition, and so we'll have to work with that periodically. In terms of your reading strategy, read it with me. Most plays are written to be performed, not read. When reading drama, it's important to identify the text structures that provide different kinds of information. Text structures include dialogue, the words spoken by the actors, and stage directions, details the playwright includes about the setting and action. Stage directions may be set in italic type or in brackets to distinguish them from dialogue. As you read Act 1 of the Crucible, use a chart like the one shown to the right there to examine how information from the two parts of text structures contribute to your understanding of the characters. Also, do notice the vocabulary words listed for you at the bottom of 1123. They will end up on the exam, so you want to be sure that you know those. All right, let's turn to some background information now on 1124 and following, and take a few notes now as we get ready. In 1692, the British colony of Massachusetts was convulsed by a witchcraft hysteria that resulted in the execution of 20 people and the jailing of more than 100 others. So let's go ahead. Now we're talking actual history. So let's write that down. 20 people die, over 100 people are in prison. The incident, though unprecedented for New England, was not unique. During the 16th and 17th centuries, witch hunts swept through Europe, resulting in tens of thousands of executions. Many of the accused were guilty only of practicing folk customs that had survived in Europe since pre-Christian times. In an era when religion and politics were intertwined, witch hunts were often politically motivated. England's James I, for example, wrote a treatise on witchcraft and sometimes accused his enemies of practicing the black arts. It was a cry that resonated well with a superstitious populace. If you don't like somebody, call them a witch, you can jack them. We said this already in earlier lectures as we were talking about some of those early Puritan thinkers and sinners in the hands of an angry God and that kind of thing. You'll obviously recognize the challenge then of how do you say defend yourself against the accusation of witchcraft, for example. For the New England colonies, the witchcraft episode was perhaps inevitable. The colonists endured harsh conditions and punishing hardship from day to day, finding themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control: bitter weather, sickness and death, devastating fires, drought, insect infestations that kill their crops. Many colonists attributed their misfortunes to the powers of evil. They were fearful people and believed that witches, servants of the devil, were real and dangerous. In the small parish of Salem Village, many were quick to blame witchcraft when the minister's daughter and several other girls were afflicted by seizures and lapsed into unconsciousness, especially after it was learned that the girls had been dabbling in fortune-telling with the minister's slave Tituba. They were not dancing in the woods as portrayed in the play. At first, only Tituba and two elderly women were called witches, but the hunt spread until some of the colony's most prominent citizens stood accused. Many historians have seen a pattern of social and economic animosity behind the accusations, but most scholars feel that mass hysteria was also a strong contributing factor. This is important next. Let's write this in our notes. A crucible, write this down, is a heat-resistant container in which metals are melted or fused at very high temperatures. So a crucible is just a container that you can heat up, and you can melt metal and put different kinds of metal together. The word is used symbolically to suggest a severe trial or a test. So write that down. The title of our play is used symbolically to denote some kind of a really serious challenge, or trial, or a test. Miller chose his title well, as the play depicts severely trying times. When The Crucible was first published, Arthur Miller added a note about the play's historical accuracy. Quote, "This play is not history in the sense in which the word is used by the academic historian. Dramatic purposes have sometimes required many characters to be fused into one. The number of girls involved in the crying out has been reduced. Abigail's age has been raised. While there were several judges of almost equal authority, I've symbolized them in Hawthorne and Danforth. However, I believe that the reader will discover here the essential nature of one of the strangest and most awful chapters in human history. The fate of each character is exactly that of his historical model, and there is no one in the drama who did not play a similar, and in some cases exactly the same role in history," end quote. You have your characters listed there at the bottom of page 1125. Let's pay attention just for a second to a bit of historical background. Let me just read this to you to help you at least get a sense of the time that this play is set. Among the Puritans in the Massachusetts colony of which Salem was a part, the fear that grew from living in harsh conditions on the edge of the wilderness was compounded by several factors. In 1643, the preacher Roger Williams, whose open-minded views angered the Puritans, fled south to establish the colony of Rhode Island, where Anabaptists, Jews, Quakers, and freethinkers were welcomed on the principle of religious freedom. As we've said in earlier lectures, one of the ironies of all ironies is that the colonies, especially certain areas of the colonies, certain colonies, were established because of religious intolerance in England. And the irony of all ironies is that when those people arrived, one of the first things they did was to practice religious intolerance. Again, it's one of the dark ironies. In 1660, just to continue, we're just taking notes now. By the way, what I'm reading is not actually in your book, okay? What I'm reading, you're just taking notes over. I'm just giving you a bit of historical background. In 1660, Puritan leader Oliver Cromwell's rule of England ended and monarchy was restored. The new King Charles I revoked the charters guaranteeing the American colonies self-government, alarming the New England Puritans on both economic and religious grounds. In the mid-1670s, conflicts between English settlers and Native Americans trying to repossess their lands escalated into King Philip's War, named for a Wampauga chief known as King Philip. The Salem witchcraft trials grew out of a climate of unrest and fear in which the New England Puritans saw enemies and dangers on all sides. In an earlier lecture, we pointed out that one of the things that's significant about understanding the early American situation and the exclusivity that was practiced in the colonies has everything to do with that mantra that I gave. There weren't no Walmarts when those cats arrived. In other words, it's total survival in every way. And because it's survival, then there's a certain kind of a requirement that we all have to pull together, work together. So if you got one person who has some kind of individual idea of stepping outside of the group, that individual will get jacked. So you've got this dynamic in play that's obviously going to be played out in the Crucible, where if you want to accuse someone of anything, accuse them of not being a part of the group. Accuse them, for example, of not believing in the beliefs of the group, and that individual will very quickly be harshly marginalized in some way. All right, let's turn now to 1126 in Act 1. First, there's an overture as the play is about to be started. You got a small upper bedroom in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. We're in Salem, Massachusetts, the spring of the year 1692. There's a narrow window at the left, though its leaded panes, through its leaded panes, the morning sunlight streams. A candle still burns near the bed, which is at the right. A chest, a chair, a small table, or are the other furnishings. At the back, a door opens on the landing of the stairway on the ground to the ground floor. The room gives off an air of clean sparseness. The roof rafters are exposed, and the wood colors are raw and unmellowed. As the curtain rises, Reverend Paris is discovered kneeling beside the bed, evidently in prayer. His daughter, Betty Paris, aged 10, is lying on the bed, inert. Now, what I want you to be doing here as we work together at level 1 is just simply bullet pointing what happens. Now, once we get to the end of an act, we will then do a full annotation. Does that make sense, what I just said? So once we get to the end of the act, we will then ask about level 2 and level 3. But for now, all we're doing is just simply recording at level 1 what are the things that are happening. So for example, right now you would want to write down that the play will open with Reverend Paris and Betty, his daughter, in bed, and something's wrong with her. And clearly Paris is very upset. Before we get to the opening lines, though, Arthur Miller has left us some information. Let's read together, starting on 11:26. At the time of these events, Paris was in his middle 40s. In history, he cut a villainous path, and there is very little good to be said for him. He believed he was being persecuted wherever he went, despite his best efforts to win people and God to his side. In meeting, he felt insulted if someone rose to shut the door without first asking his permission. He was a widower with no interest in children or talent with them. He regarded them as young adults, and until this strange crisis, he, like the rest of Salem, never conceived that children were anything but thankful for being permitted to walk straight, eyes slightly lowered, arms at the sides, mouths shut until bidden to speak. His house stood in the town, but we today could hardly call it a village. The meeting house was nearby, and from this point outward toward the bay or inland, there were a few small, windowed, dark houses snuggling against the raw Massachusetts winter. Salem had been established hardly 40 years before. To the European world, the whole province was a barbaric frontier inhabited by a sect of fanatics who nevertheless were shipping out products of slowly increasing quantity and value. No one can really know what their lives were like. They had no novelists and would not have permitted anyone to read a novel if one were handy. Their creed forbade anything resembling a theater or, quote, vain enjoyment, end quote. They did not celebrate Christmas, and a holiday from work meant only that they must concentrate even more upon prayer. We've commented in earlier lectures, by the way, about these Calvinist Puritans, if you want to go back and review that information. Which is not to say that nothing broke into this strict and somber way of life. When a new farmhouse was built, friends assembled to raise the roof. And there would be special foods cooked. I'm at the top of 11:27. And there would be special foods cooked and probably some potent cider passed around. There was a good supply of ne'er-do-wells in Salem who dallied at the shuffleboard in Bridget Bishop's tavern. Probably more than the creed, hard work kept the morals of the place from spoiling, for the people were forced to fight the land like heroes for every grain of corn, and no man had very much time for fooling around. That there were some jokers, however, is indicated by the practice of appointing a two-man parole whose duty was to walk forth in the time of God's worship to take notice of such as either lie about the meeting house without attending to the work and ordinances, or that lie at home or in the fields without giving good account thereof, and to take the names of such persons and to present them to the magistrates whereby they may be accordingly proceeded against, end quote. In other words, you're not allowed to mess around. You'll always have to be working. This predilection for minding other people's business was time-honored among the people of Salem, and it undoubtedly created many of the suspicions which were to feed the coming madness. I should just point out, those of us who live in a small town understand very well what it means that everybody seems to know everybody's business, right? This is definitely the case in the small town of Salem. It was also, in my opinion, Arthur Miller here is the writer here, it was also, in my opinion, one of the things that a John Proctor would rebel against. For the time of the armed camp had almost passed, and since the country was reasonably, although not wholly safe, the old disciplines were beginning to rankle. But as in all such matters, the issue was not clear-cut, for danger was still a possibility, and in unity still lay the best promise of safety, as we've already said. Survival is key in this time period, so you got to have everybody together. You can't have anybody saying, I'm going my own way. The edge of the wilderness was close by. The American continent stretched endlessly west, and it was full of mystery for them. It stood dark and threatening over their shoulders night and day, for out of it Indian tribes marauded from time to time, and Reverend Paris had parishioners who had lost relatives to these quote-unquote heathens. The parochial snobbery of these people was partly responsible for their failure to convert the Indians. Probably they also preferred to take land from heathens rather than from fellow Christians. This is an observation that has been made more than a few times, and it was certainly made before Arthur Miller, that one of the reasons why so few of the Native Americans were encouraged to convert to Christianity was because it's a lot more uncomfortable to take land away from a fellow Christian than it is to simply call them non-Christian heathens, and then you could basically take their land and even kill them if you're so inclined. At any rate, back to the reading, very few Indians were converted, and the Salem folk believed that the virgin forest was the devil's last preserve, his home base and the citadel of his final stand. To the best of their knowledge, the American forest was the last place on earth that was not paying homage to God. I'll just pause for a moment to point out, by the way, you will appreciate the difference in the whole view that is being expressed here of a Puritan view with, for example, Henry David Thoreau's transcendentalist view that it's in the woods that one goes to find, as he says in Walden, the essential facts of life. Right? For these reasons, among others, back to the reading, for these reasons, among others, they carried about an air of innate resistance, even of persecution. Their fathers had, of course, been persecuted in England. So now they and their church found it necessary to deny any other sect its freedom, lest their New Jerusalem be defiled and corrupted by wrong ways and deceitful ideas. Again, as we pointed out, the irony of all ironies, a people who left England for religious intolerance practiced religious intolerance. Back to the reading. They believed, in short, that they held in their steady hands the candle that would light the world. We have inherited this belief, and it has helped and hurt us. It helped them with the discipline it gave them. They were a dedicated folk by and large, and they had to survive the life they had chosen or been born into in this country. Back on page 1128. The proof of their belief's value to them may be taken from the opposite character of the first Jamestown settlement further south in Virginia. The Englishmen who landed there were motivated mainly by a hunt for profit. They had thought to pick off the wealth of the new country and then return rich to England. They were a band of individualists and a very much ingratiating group than the Massachusetts men. So in your notes, as you're taking notes here, just make the observation that what Miller is now going to do is to show us some differences between the Salem group and the Jamestown group as two different types of groups of people. The Salem group more interested in religion, the Jamestown group more interested in economics. But Virginia destroyed them, the Jamestown group. Massachusetts tried to kill off the Puritans, but they combined. They set up a communal society, which in the beginning was little more than an armed camp with an autocratic and very devoted leadership. It was, however, an autocracy by consent, for they were united from top to bottom by a commonly held ideology whose perpetuation was the reason and justification for all their sufferings. So their self-denial, their purposefulness, their suspicion of all vain pursuits, their hard-handed justice were altogether perfect instruments for the conquest of this space so antagonistic to man. In other words, their religious exclusivity allowed for them, their theocracy as we sometimes call it, when politics and religion go together entirely, allowed for them to be able to remain united and to stay alive in the woods of Massachusetts. But the people of Salem in 1692 were not quite the dedicated folk that arrived on the Mayflower. A vast differentiation had taken place, and in their own time, a revolution had unseated the royal government and substituted a junta which was at this moment in power. The times, to their eyes, must have been out of joint, and to the common folk must have seemed as insoluble and complicated as do ours today. It's not hard to see how easily many could have been led to believe that the time of confusion had been brought upon them by deep and darkening forces. To hint of such speculation appears on the court record, but social disorder in any age breeds such mystical suspicions, and when, as in Salem, wonders were brought forth from below the social surface, it is too much to expect people to hold back very long from laying on the victims with all the force of their frustrations. The Salem tragedy, which is about to begin in these pages, developed from a paradox. Let's write this down in our notes. This tragedy of Salem began in a paradox, two things that don't fit together. It's a paradox in whose grip we still live. Of course, Arthur Miller, acutely aware of what he's doing here, given that he's writing this play and about to perform this play during the time of Joseph McCarthy and the McCarthy scare, of Red Scare or whatever. Simply, it was this. For good purposes, even high purposes, the people of Salem developed a theocracy, a combine of state and religious power, whose function was to keep the community together and to prevent any kind of disunity that might open it to destruction by material or ideological enemies. It was forged for a necessary purpose and accomplished that purpose. But all organization is and must be grounded on the idea of exclusion and prohibition, just as two objects cannot occupy the same space. The top of page 1129. Evidently, the time came in New England when the repressions of order were heavier than seemed warranted by the dangers against which the order was organized. The witch hunt was a perverse manifestation of the panic which set in among all classes when the balance began to turn toward greater individual freedom. When one rises above the individual villainy displayed, one can only pity them all, just as we shall be pitied someday. That is a compelling line, and many people have called Arthur Miller kind of a prophet in this regards, because we do look back to the 1950s and the time of the McCarthy era, and we do have pity, both for those